the reason why I had felt so abandoned is because I was looking to something that didn't exist when in fact, like, all of my reality was me more being like in the womb of God, like a child in its mother's womb, where there was like nowhere for me to go that was outside of God.
Hey everyone, welcome to Holiness Connection. Today I'm so happy to welcome Heather Hamilton, who is joining us from Georgia. She's the mother of three kids, and she's going to today be talking to us about her new book, which is called Returning to Eden, a field guide for the spiritual journey. Welcome, Heather. And if you want to hold up that book, do you have it there?
Yeah, here it is right here, Returning to Eden. I didn't do this cover, so I love holding it up because I can be like, look how awesome this cover is. I just love the artwork.
Yeah, I love that
Uh,
cover too.
yeah, a man named Ralph Polendo did it. And it's just, yeah, I love it. So thanks for inviting me and having me on.
Yeah, there's so many touch points to, what I talk about in this channel and my own spiritual journey. So
Hmm.
I'm really excited for all the different parts we're going to talk about today. But let's start at the beginning. So maybe just start by just telling us a little bit about your background and how that led you to come to write this book, Returning to Eden.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Bible Belt, kind of moving around quite a bit between Georgia and Texas. So I was in the South, and it was a very, I think it was pretty an unremarkable, like evangelical upbringing. Maybe with the one caveat that, for I think a lot of people who were raised like in an evangelical church, a lot of people feel like, this was kind of just part of my family's tradition, and or I sort of got drugged to church. I didn't really have a say in the matter. Um, and for me, I was first kind of invited to church when I was 7 by a neighbor. They were missionaries and lived across the street. And I started going to this program called Awana, which was like for kids, and you like memorize little Bible verses and get little pins, and like it was great. And so I feel like my introduction was voluntary. I really loved being there. And then after that, I would like ride the church bus. It was like a bus that came and picked up kids on Sunday mornings. And so I would get picked up and, spend an hour going to pick up other kids and go to Sunday school. And then eventually, my family started coming, but every time we would move, I, I was really like the driving force. It was like, I got to find my youth group. I got to find my church. I was always like looking for that anchor. So yeah, it was, I feel like I was there voluntarily and it wasn't forced on me. And I really liked, thrived, and enjoyed the environment. It was like, why wouldn't everybody want to be here? So I grew up in that. And then after, or actually during college, got involved, in like a big mega church in our area. And that kind of continued throughout college and after college. And I eventually met my husband, and we had our three kids, and he became the music director at this really large church. And we were just like rocking and rolling. Like it just felt like, you know, this was the trajectory, and we were all in, and everything made sense, et cetera, et cetera. I think you get the picture. So the change really came when I had some right after my third child was born. She was about 10 weeks old. And it almost felt like a divine intervention or a lightning strike or something. But I essentially had some really precise and clear revelations about my own personal life, um, which uh, kind of threw me into this identity crisis that sort of spiraled downward really quickly. And so, really, over the course of like a few days, I went from sort of knowing myself in one way as this like successful American Christian, wife, mom, businesswoman, etc., to someone whose like nervous system was just completely overwhelmed and I was spiraling out of control. And so, really, in the course of a few days, I had this kind of psychological descent into a really dark, dark place. And kind of one night at the bottom of this hole, as I'm like crying out to God to help me and deliver me. I think, I had a concept of God sort of being an entity out there that would like rescue me, like rescue his child from such a dark place. And as I was like crying out to God, begging him to do this, I just had this overwhelming experience of nothingness. It just felt like being untethered out in space, like floating off into the darkness and just knowing that like nobody was coming to get me. Um, like whatever I was praying to, like didn't exist. That concept just kind of evaporated, which felt quite devastating to me. And like psychologically, I understood like this was like an experience of hell. I'd always had this concept of hell as being like, eternal damnation in the afterlife or whatever. And in this experience, I found myself sort of in this state of consciousness where I knew, like, oh, this is what hell was. And it was like completely terrifying. I remember, kind of consciously saying to myself, like, I wouldn't wish this on anybody. And that includes like anybody. I just felt like, this was so overwhelmingly devastating. Yeah, I wouldn't wish that kind of like psychological torture on anyone. Anyway, all that to say is I sort of had this, you know, no pun intended, but like come to Jesus moment where I was like, no one's helping me. My nervous system is completely overwhelmed and shot, and I can't live like this. I had never experienced like suicidal ideation before that, but I really quickly understood that I couldn't go on living like this. Um, and so I told my husband, I need some help. I need you to call 911. And the reason why this felt like such a huge surrender for me is because, as I mentioned, I had just had a baby. I had 3 kids at this point. And in my mind, I felt if I ask for help and call 911, I'm going to be taken to a psychiatric facility, which means I'm going to be separated from my kids. And that up until that point just felt like that can't happen. And this was sort of like my surrender to like, okay, I, this is my fate and I'm surrendering to my fate and that's it. So anyway, so we call 911 and as soon as I open the door, um, there's 2 people on my front porch. And as I start speaking, and the person across from me starts speaking, I immediately recognized her as a transgender woman. And again, being super evangelical with that worldview in the South, this was like very shocking to me. I hadn't had many encounters with people who were transgender, and in this very vulnerable moment, I realized like, oh wow, I don't know if I trust you. I kind of realized like I think in these times of vulnerability, I really only have trust with people who I feel like are in tribe and have the same kind of worldview as I do. And so I had this moment of fear, but again, there were no other options. So I just start speaking. And as I'm interacting with this woman, I had kind of tried all week to get the people in my life to understand like the depth of the psychological crisis that I was in, and no one could really get it. They didn't quite understand like what was happening. And as I'm speaking to this woman, I suddenly just felt completely enveloped in this like benevolent, compassionate, loving presence. Like it felt like this thick texture around me. And like for the first time in that week, like she was the first person who really saw me, like right to my depths. And I felt held by Christ. Like it felt literally like I was speaking to Christ, and I felt like kind of swept up in this mystical bubble that felt like heaven or eternity or something like that. And it really like was that fast, like from a moment of terror to just like kind of caught up like metaphorically in the clouds with this woman who was trans. And so I'm like, I'm kind of having this 30,000 foot view of myself going like, this doesn't compute with my worldview, in my belief system. Christ can't speak to me through uh, another like, Christ is Jesus. I'm not understanding how Christ is speaking to me through another human, much less like a transgender human, which I have, certain predispositions about because of my belief system. But that was what was happening. So it was like this collision with reality, which was was like the pivot point in my life. From there, I actually did not go to a psychiatric facility. I went to my counselor and did like 6 months of this therapy called EMDR, which is like a trauma based therapy. It was extremely like life changing for me, but my it the whole experience really like cratered my theology. And so, I sort of had to rebuild my theology based on the experience of Christ that I had, with this woman. So I'll pause it for there, right
Yeah.
there, because I know that's getting a little long. But that was the encounter and experience that I had that really changed everything.
Yeah. I guess I'd be curious to know, because it sounds like in that moment, I mean, it's that mystical bubble kind of thing, almost like what you're talking about. You're almost just surrendering to it in the moment.
Hmm.
Um, and then was it over, like, what kind of sort of time frame, like, was it over that then it started to become, oh, I'm actually like, in my conscious mind working through my theology?
Um, that was So first, in terms of just like getting a handle on my nervous system and kind of bringing it all back down to baseline, um, the first month was probably like focused on that. Like I have to get this under control because I had to take care of my kids. Like that was, you know, step number one. But really quickly after that, probably over the next 4 months or so, I knew that I didn't believe in hell anymore as a place of eternal damnation. And really, I think that maybe the biggest linchpin for me was the concept of like original sin. Um, until that point, anytime someone in my life would, have like bad behavior or addiction or something like that, or, you'd have someone in the church where it's like, well, they've, had an affair and cheated on their wife or whatever. Um, it'd be something super destructive. And the explanation was always like, it's just sin, like this is just who we inherently are, and it's kind of up to us to like resist this pull towards um our inherent badness or our inherent evil. And then sometimes people can't resist, and then this is what happens, like your life gets destroyed. So it always just felt like sin was just this scapegoat answer that I really didn't question because it was so just built in. It felt like obvious, And then suddenly, through doing my own therapy and understanding the way that, you know, trauma had affected my brain and even just our personality structures and how, each of us have, nervous systems that are wired a certain way that are just gonna react instantaneously to things in the environment without even us being consciously aware of it. So the more I started understanding about my own psychology and then understanding how certain patterns and personality type structures were just on autopilot in everyone around me, I started to see like, no, I think that the deepest, most inner part of myself is good. And it actually, I felt in that moment with the trans woman, where I sensed Christ coming from her, I also felt Christ like welling up inside of me. And so it was like, this interaction between these two like things, kind of creating this relational resonance that all of it, felt like Christ. I understood that that was the deepest part of who I was, and that the reason why I had behaved in certain ways was more due to trauma or my personality type structure, or really just being asleep to that awareness. And
Yeah.
so suddenly the explanation of sin, I came to understand sin as being asleep to that deepest part of myself. And so, yeah, so all that started to get reworked over the course of a few months, and even reorienting my understanding of God, not as someone who was out there who was going to come rescue me, but more as like uh, the bedrock of everything, like this presence that was saturating and flowing through everything. And so, the reason why I had felt so abandoned is because I was looking to something that didn't exist, when in fact, like, all of my reality was me more being like in the womb of God, like a child in its mother's womb, where there was like nowhere for me to go that was outside of God.
Yeah.
So I hope that that metaphor makes sense. But yeah,
Mhm.
I, the part that I felt really grateful about, because, I've seen a lot of people like deconstruct theology and, you know, um, end up in various places. But for me, it was like anchored in this mystical experience where I did have this experience of something. Um, in my book, I say, it felt like the most real moment of my life, like the most vivid, thick moment where my senses were like most alert and most heightened. Um, and so it wasn't about like dismissing, everything about my religion or everything I had been taught, but it was like all the stories and the symbols and the words had this different meaning,
Mhm.
um, that I knew even when I talked about God, with people. Sometimes I was aware that we weren't talking about the same thing, even though we were using the same word.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so there's so many ways I could go with this. I mean, I should say too that I definitely resonate with what you're saying, because I had a similar, both in the sense of, it being a mystical experience that I call my spiritual awakening back in 2009, and it also related to my healing journey. So,
Mhm,
and also the piece that you said about it feeling more real, because
mhm,
people sometimes will think that means I felt very ecstatic, so people will think, oh, that means I was off in the ethers. I actually felt the most grounded and in my body and present than I'd ever felt
mhm.
as well. And I want to get back to the healing part and the wholeness part and all of that. Before we do, let's talk a little bit about what you were saying about, still about the theology changing, and um, after you've had this experience. Because in the book, you take a very scriptural approach.
Mhm.
And so it reminds me a lot, actually, about Madeline L'Engle's my favorite author, and growing up always was. And one time I heard her speak on the literal versus the metaphoric, and she was speaking about how the metaphoric was more true, and if you got
Yeah.
very literal, you'd get away from the truth. And that reminded me a lot of your work and your book. So I was curious if you could just tell us how you view scripture now and what it means to you now from this new way of looking at it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, up until that point, scripture was like everything's literal, everything's historical, which at the time I thought meant, if I just believed that, that was a marker of how much faith I had. Like if I just believed that Jonah was swallowed by this whale, and, it was literally a man in a literal whale's belly who was literally out in the ocean for 3 days. And it was, I believed this like a CNN headline or something. Then that was a testament to how much faith I had in God, because that meant God, can do anything, even things that seem impossible or scientifically implausible or whatever. And so I actually had a lot of distrust around like science or empirical evidence or whatever, because like to hold that literal view of faith means like you have to have this cognitive dissonance about, reality. And so, I remember like if I would read a news story or something that would say, it looks like scientists can disprove this thing, about the Bible or whatever. It would just be like, no, you know what I mean? Like I'm totally closed off to that whatsoever. And so there was really like just this lack of curiosity about the world around me and how it worked because that was so threatening. And I really I had a lot of compassion for myself, and I do have compassion for people who do think that because, seeing what the psychological crash and burn that I had to have to become more open, like nobody would voluntarily sign up for that. I felt like it was so intense. It was like life threatening to me. And so we're not wired to like just go jump off psychological cliffs. And so I really had to be like forced into that in order to be able to see something in a new way. Um, but to answer your question, when I was in that psychological hell, which I understood to be hell, something that immediately like rose into my awareness, like pretty much in the moment, was the Jonah and the whale story. And I understood that like the the psychological place that I was in was the belly of the whale. I felt sucked into this darkness where everything I knew and understood was cut off, and I knew that I was essentially alone, maybe not physically, but certainly like emotionally and psychologically. It was just a cutting off from everything. And so I, I kind of immediately understood that this is what the Jonah and the whale story was about. And whether Jonah was a historical figure or not, immediately was so irrelevant to me. I did not care that it wasn't an interesting question anymore because I knew, oh, the pattern of transformation that I am experiencing right now in my life is what this story is about, period. And so I that's what I really am trying to like introduce in my book. So the word for that is myth. It's a mythical story. And up until that point, the word myth essentially meant the same thing as lie, like if someone had come into my evangelical world and said, like, oh, Jonah and the whale, is just a myth. It seems like, that's denigrating to the story, it's devaluing it. And my goal here was to like infuse more value into the story where it was immediately like a symbolic roadmap for my personal salvation, essentially, my own death and resurrection. And so I kind of understood like instead of hell or the belly of the whale being this place to avoid, um, it was no, this is where the old Heather, the old personality is going to get broken down, like just like what happens in a belly, and it's going to get metabolized, and that energy is going to be used to form a new body or a new creation, and there's going to be this rebirth out of the belly. And that is what's symbolized when Jonah gets spit out and he goes back, he's on the shore in the ordinary world and he has like this newfound word or message or consciousness, in that Bible story, like there's still more for him to work out. He's still kind of disgruntled about it. Um, but we see the same pattern in Jesus later, where he says, you're going to see the sign of Jonah. That always felt a little confusing to me because it was like, why is he talking about this guy, getting swallowed by a fish? And I realized that he's naming this pattern that keeps showing up, and this pattern that shows up in these mythic stories. And so, yeah, to your point about metaphor and it being something deeper and more real, like these psychological and spiritual transformational experiences, they're ineffable, it's like it's beyond language. And so the closest thing we have in language to kind of point to those experiences are metaphor, like when I say, you know, someone close to me dies and I say like my heart broke into 1,000 pieces. Like to take that literally would be ridiculous. Of course, like my physical heart is still intact right here, but I'm using that picture to like express the energy of the depth of the feeling. And so that's more akin to what I think is going on in these stories.
Yeah, that's a really good example, actually. Just pulled from our everyday speech. I mean, how
Mhm.
true that is, and how people there's an understanding there that's really deep that is
Yeah.
is conveyed by that, even though we're not, it's not a literal thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's come to the healing journey here with, because you mentioned something about the personality, being reborn, basically, right? And
Mhm.
so that being a lot of it, the trajectory often is about, things falling away. And you did definitely speak about it as a journey towards the true self. And then there's a falling away of the false self. However, there's also that piece that you mentioned that some other people at least mention as well, that I've heard of different spiritual teachers and leaders, um, which is this idea that it is this process, though, and it's like you can't sort of skip that step of having
Right.
that false self that is then the thing that drops away, that's an essential part too. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little more about that, how you see that, both the
Yeah.
overall journey towards the true self and then also that piece where the false self is essential.
Yeah. I forgot I had this right here. Hold on. Okay, so in the book I use this picture of like a seed. So I have like this little acorn that I keep up on my desk. But when I ask you to like picture a seed, or I'm like, hey, picture an acorn seed, like this is what you're gonna think of. But actually, the the part that is gonna germinate into an oak tree is the embryo that's hidden inside the shell. And so I use this metaphor in the book to kind of explain the process of, the first thing that grows on an oak tree is going to be this green embryo. But then in order for that embryo to like take its life journey and try to realize its destiny is this hard shell that has to form over top of it. And the purpose of this is to protect it, on its journey through nature and through all of the elements. And it's brutal. And if the embryo didn't have this protective shell, as soon as it hit the ground and it rained, it would just be washed away, and it would never have an opportunity to be buried in the ground and germinate and grow into this tree. And so that felt like such a pristine metaphor for what I was experiencing, where when I was on my porch and I talked about like that feeling of Christ welling up, it felt like the deepest, truest part of me, which in the same moment felt totally foreign, like something I had never experienced before, but also immediately familiar. Like it was like, oh, this was always me and this was always here. It didn't feel like something that got deposited into me from an outside source, which is how, in evangelicalism, it's you accept Jesus into your heart. It's this picture of like Jesus is out here and you pray this prayer sincerely and then he comes into your heart. And so it's this external thing that gets deposited into you. And suddenly I realized that this this was never outside of me. It was the deepest, deepest part of me, this embryo that had suddenly, the outer shell had cracked. The outer shell being my personality type structure, that I had completely identified with. I think a more popular term for it is the ego. But the ego a lot of times has like a really negative connotation. But essentially, what I'm just trying to highlight in the book is that there's there's nothing wrong or negative about this shell. It's completely needed. It's just a part of the process. And so to kind of get away from this dualistic, you know, framing of like flesh and spirit and true self and false self, or ego and essence, or whatever, like they're all necessary parts of the process. And so instead of judging them as good or bad or whatever, we understand the process. And in that, we understand when it's time for this outer shell to die. So really where we start getting into trouble is when, we've completely fallen asleep to that inner embryo or the inner true self, which I think is an inevitable process. In the story of Adam and Eve, it says that Adam went to sleep. And something I found interesting, like in my research, is that it never says that he woke up. He goes to sleep, and then it's almost like all the calamity that happens afterwards is sort of this dream-like state until, we see this archetypal pattern of this man who's asleep, and, all the destruction and everything that happens throughout the story arc of the Bible, until we see Jesus, who's called the second Adam. And it's this picture of the awakened man, and you kind of realize, like, oh, everything in the past was, and this is how it felt for me. It felt like waking up from a dream. A huge shift for me personally was having compassion for myself and then the inevitability of falling asleep and coming to identify completely with the outer shell, and then realizing, um, this is what's happening for everybody. So, and then also being aware of how painful it was for that shell to start falling away. I had made all these decisions in my life based on identifying with this ego or false self or outer shell. And then suddenly it was like there was this new life, or, my essence coming to life. And, you know, a lot of things in my life, which represented the shell, didn't fit anymore. I was growing out of them. And so, what did that mean for, all my responsibilities in life, or, the relationships that I had, and all of that felt very, very painful. So, you know, kind of as you said, being grounded in the body, but also very ecstatic. It was that, and then also this really intimate relationship with pain and suffering, and going like, oh, that's part of this experience too. And so I was very alert and sensitive and present to it, but it wasn't like, I think sometimes when we describe this, it sounds like very romantic, like a spiritual awakening. Ooh, like it's actually a shit show, like it felt like a huge train wreck. And, looking at the stories, especially of Jesus, I'm like, yes, of course it feels that way. It's a crucifixion on a cross. And for me, it was this psychological crucifixion of dying to the old self. And that is filled, with grief and despair at the most intense level. So
Yes.
anyway, yeah, I just couldn't help but start to see the whole world with compassionate eyes.
Yeah. So yeah, I just want to point to the fact too, yeah, like what you were saying about the asleep and awake, of course, right? That, I mean, the universality of talking about a spiritual awakening, the difficult parts, the part, at least in the Catholic tradition, I think, believe they have the dark night of the soul,
Yeah.
the spirit of dark night of spirit and dark night of sense. Yeah, so there is this sort of universality to this process, which I think is really interesting and maybe gets to that depth of the trueness too.